when evening's falling, you'll hear me calling. Come on home now to the county down.
Hello, my name is Mike Connolly. I'm a longtime teacher at St. Joseph's College, where I teach in the Department of History and Political Science, and I'm also a proud supporter of the work of the Maine Irish Heritage Center. The documentary film that I'm introducing today is entitled Building Bridges: The Connections Between Maine's Governor Joseph Brennan and Senator George Mitchell. The two themes that I'll be exploring in this documentary are building bridges and the connections that bridges make between people and places. And secondly, the issue of choices that people make over time and the consequences long-term of these choices. I'd like to briefly introduce each of these people, Joe Brennan, and then George Mitchell, and the ethnic roots that they share. Joe Brennan's father, John, was from the tiny townland of Roisin na Mania in the far west of County Galway, Ireland. His mother, Catherine Mulcairn, was from the neighboring townland of Calafinish. George Mitchell's father, George, was the orphan son of Irish immigrants. He never knew his parents, but his adoptive parents adopted him from the altar, which was a common practice at that time in the churches, especially Catholic churches. George Mitchell's mother, Mintaha Saad, or later known as Mary, emigrated from her native Lebanon. Both his parents settled in Waterville, where they married in the early 1920s, and George was the fourth born of 5 children. In terms of place, George Mitchell was born in Hedda Falls, a region of Waterville, which was heavily working class, Lebanese, French, and other ethnic groups, most of whom worked in the textile mills. He attended a Maronite church and also a school, a parochial school that was attached to that Maronite Catholic church. Joe Brennan was born and raised on 31 Kellogg Street in the Munjoy Hill district of the East End of Portland. His father was a longshoreman. He worked with my grandfather, Coleman Connolly, on the waterfront of Portland. George Mitchell's father was a utility laborer in Waterville and eventually became a janitor at Colby College. His mother, Mary, worked as a textile worker in the mills of Waterville. Both of these people had solidly working class and ethnic backgrounds. This was a strong influence in the politics and the life choices of both George Mitchell and Joe Brennan. Also indicative was the role of education in both of these young men. It was a strong influence on their politics and their life choices. A strong influence of education in the form of Joe Brennan's attendance at Boston College as an undergraduate and his eventual law degree from Maine Law, and in the case of George Mitchell, his attendance at Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine.
He was born and raised in Maine, in Waterville. His mother was an immigrant, his father the orphan son of immigrants. They worked hard all their lives in factories in the Waterville area. He worked his way through college and law school and served as a military intelligence officer in Germany. He was a trial attorney in the Department of Justice, a United States attorney, and a widely respected federal judge. His concern and compassion emerged from the very fabric of his own life here in Maine. As our senator, he has already achieved an exceptional record. He is George Mitchell, the senator for Maine and the nation.
But you cannot be an immigrant's child in this country and become majority leader of the Senate. You cannot rise from the roots that Senator Dole came out of in Russell, Kansas. You can't be somebody like me who had the privilege, and I mean this sincerely, for a brief period in my early childhood to live in a place that didn't have any indoor plumbing, so I never got to forget what other people had to live like. and have the gifts that we have been given without knowing that our primary obligation is not to solve every problem that is before us, but to leave this country well enough off that the American dream is still alive for everybody that comes after us. And that is why this scholarship tonight is so important to me, because you could not do anything for George Mitchell that would be more fitting. It's better than a statue. It's better than a plaque. It's better than an endowment for some other purpose, because what you are doing is giving him a chance in his name to create other George Mitchells, to give other young people a chance to live out their dreams, and to prove that the dream that made him what he is still alive and real in this country today. I thank you for that, because I have known very few Americans that remotely embodied the qualities of this country in their purest sense, as well as George Mitchell does. And this gift you have given him does that as well.
The Iranians took the American hostages, and President Carter, you recall the frustration of that era, authorized a rescue effort to try to rescue the hostages. That was the famous one that failed, the helicopters failed in the desert. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance was opposed to that effort and urged the president not to do it. When the president went ahead with it over the secretary's advice, Secretary Vance resigned. President Carter then appointed Senator Muskie to be Secretary of State, creating a vacancy in the Senate.
Senator Muskie brings to the senior position in a president's cabinet years of experience in foreign policy, a very deep and profound knowledge of our country.
At the height of the Iranian hostage crisis, President Jimmy Carter named Ed Muskie his Secretary of State. It was up to Governor Joe Brennan to choose Muskie's replacement.
I say this in an attempt, in a sense, to squelch so-called reliable sources' rumors. It gets a little awkward when I wake up in the morning and I read the paper and I find that somebody is going to be appointed or some decision has been made.
Well, first, I honestly felt a deep responsibility to get the very ablest person, because I was going to make a decision for a 2.5-year appointment that's usually made by 600,000 Mainers.
And when he was all through, he was clearly undecided. He hadn't made a choice and seemed puzzled and wondered if there was anybody else. And it's only in that context. I wasn't there trying to sell George, because George had not indicated, George had not spoken to anybody about any interest he had in it.
And I asked him whether he was interested in the U.S. Senate seat. I called him, and he said he was. And once he said he was, I knew in my own mind that is where I was going.
And Joe Brennan was then the governor of Maine, another terrific guy who he and I had run for governor in 1974 in the Democratic primary, and I won that primary. And it was a tough campaign. Later, in '78, he ran again for governor and was elected. When the vacancy occurred, he had every reason in the world not to appoint me. Up until that time, the only election he'd ever lost was to me in the primary. It had been a tough campaign. He had many good applicants, a former governor, a former senator, a lot of people who were well qualified, were interested in the position, but I must say, at least from my perspective, much to Joe's credit, he overlooked all of that and said, I want to pick the person I think will do the best job.
It was a little awkward because I had hired George prior to that, when I was district attorney, to be one of my assistants. And he was a prestigious lawyer at that time, highly respected. And he and I tried cases together. He was only there about a year, but he did an excellent job. Yes. And he and I had a good relationship. But he was well connected, you know, he was Muskie's person. And he had resources, you know, he had a lot of friends in Washington. And he's smart and competent. So he won the primary, even though I won 4 or 5 counties with no dough, none.
Likely prospects included former Senator Bill Hathaway, former Governor Ken Curtis, maybe Speaker of the House John Martin, or even State Senator Jerry Connolly.
So I knew from day one, George Mitchell was going to be the nominee, and he was going to be the nominee because Joe Brennan wanted him.
When he offered me the appointment, he said to me, I will only ask you for two things, and two things only. First, I will ask you to keep on your staff as many of Senator Muskie's staff as you can, because he's asked me to request that of whoever I appointed. And secondly, I will ask you only to make every decision based on what you think is the right thing for the people of Maine and the country. And never, ever did he ask me to do anything else. All the time after that, when he was governor, or even after he left the governorship, to this moment, he's never asked me to do anything other than what I felt was right for the state. It's a real measure of the man, and the fact that he appointed someone who had defeated him in a previous election tells you something about what a terrific guy he is.
Well, then he says to me, well, what do you think about the openings? Who do you think is going to be interested? I mean, besides me? That's what I said.
And I can recall walking out of his office and thinking to myself, he's taking a big risk. I lost in the only statewide election I'd ever run. He himself was up for re-election next year, would be on the ballot. And if I did a poor job as his appointee in the Senate, it would have an adverse effect upon his own chances to be re-elected as governor. And I became very determined that I was going to justify his confidence in me, not just for my own sake, that I might be re-elected, but also so that I could vindicate his judgment and his decision in appointing me to the Senate. That was a big part of my motivation for the next couple of years. I did not want to let Joe Brennan down.
It's a distinct pleasure and honor for me to introduce to this group and to our nation Senator Ed Muskie, who will be our next Secretary of State.
He turned to Senator Edmund Muskie. Ed Muskie had been a mentor to George Mitchell. He counseled him after his loss to Jim Longley. He nominated Mitchell to a federal district judgeship, a position for which Mitchell was well suited and which carried a good deal of prestige.
I took it as a lifetime appointment, expecting it to be a lifetime appointment, and looked forward to it. And enjoyed it very much. Although I was a federal judge for only a short period of time, less than a year, it was a terrific, interesting, and enjoyable job, and I enjoyed it thinking that I would be there as a federal district court judge in Maine for the rest of my working life.
But 9 months into Mitchell's tenure as a judge, Muskie accepted Carter's request to serve as Secretary of State, and that meant his unexpired Senate term had to be filled. Maine's Constitution requires the governor to fill it. Sitting in the Blaine House in 1980 was Joe Brennan.
Joe Brennan had every reason in the world to appoint someone other than me. Until then, the only election he'd ever lost was to me.
A lot of people very close to me were very interested. And it was tough to say no, but we did.
To my surprise, he called me and said he would like to talk with me about the vacancy. Would I come down to Augusta and go to the Blaine House and meet with him?
Muskie went on to be Secretary of State, and I had a great appointment. It was good for not just a year, not two. I think it was good for about 30 months, longer than a congressional term. And I learned that George was interested in, from trying cases with him and working with him, even though we had run against each other. I thought he was smart, able, competent, and a person of integrity. And that's why I decided to appoint him to the Senate. And of course, 6 years later, he's the majority leader of the Senate, which is a big deal. Just they even run the operation of the Senate, the whole building down there pretty much, aside from their influence on public policy. And Mitchell's had an excellent, incredible career, probably one of the best careers of any political person in the state. But it was an important decision. Usually that decision is made by 1 million Maine people, and I had the responsibility to make it myself. and many of my dear friends were interested in the position. You know, a lot of people will serve in those places if it's handed on a silver platter. It's a grind, you know, to do it through primaries, general elections, and all that. But George has been a huge success, and he remains a good friend of mine to this day. And Senator Muskie said that the president has asked me to serve as Secretary of State. And I told them, let me see about a few things. I'm going to go up and talk with Governor Brennan. And he came there, and we sat down in the Admiral's office to discuss the issue. And I think he thought I was going to appoint somebody, you know, maybe Governor Curtis, who was excellent governor, just first rate. But obviously I had my own decisions to make. And he showed a lot of warmth at this time when he said, whoever you appoint, I would really appreciate it if you would keep my staff, you know, at least for a year, so they have a chance either to earn their way with the new senator and plan their alternatives if that wouldn't work out. I said, don't worry, I will take care of that. Whoever is appointed will be asked to keep your staff, and I understand it because they have commitments, they have mortgages. And it was really a nice statement by him, because he wasn't really known for his warm statements. I was very, very pleased. And once I agreed to that, he, in my presence, called the White House, and he talked to the president and said the green light is flashing, his way of saying, I'm all set. He got on his plane, went back, and that afternoon was appointed Secretary of State.
Well, I think a lot of people, strangely enough, wrote George Mitchell off as a politician. In fact, George Mitchell was described as unelectable a year after that race.
November 1982 was pandemonium at the State of Maine Ballroom Eastland Hotel, Mitchell headquarters in Portland. George Mitchell overcame long odds to win election to the Senate with over 60% of the vote.
I believe as a United States Senator, I represent all the people of Maine, not just those who support me, not just those who voted for me, not just Democrats, but all the people of Maine, and that's what I'm going to continue to try to do.
He did such a great job, the people of Maine, I think. In fact, he did such a great job, and he was so scarred, he thought, by losing the first time statewide. He could not have worked harder. In fact, he worked so hard. The last time he ran, I think he got 80% of the vote. Unbelievable. I think he lost one town up in Washington County. And I think he went back to that town and went door to door to see why he lost it. But he worked hard and did a great job. And certainly it's worked out well. And I think the fact that he was 6 or 7 years later elected majority leader, that he had gained the confidence of his peers. And he's still very highly regarded.
One aspect of Joe's appointment of me to the Senate is that it was widely believed that he appointed me to the Senate because Senator Muskie had asked him to, or according to many others, insisted that he do so. My first comment is that Joe made up his own mind on things. He may have asked Senator Muskie for advice. He asked me for advice sometimes. He asked a lot of people, but there was no doubt in anybody's mind. He was his own man. He was going to make his own decision. In fact, Senator Muskie asked Joe, or recommended to Joe, that he appoint Ken Curtis to replace him in the Senate. Senator Muskie was my mentor, my hero, my friend. He always tried to do what he felt was right, and I believe that he sincerely and conscientiously thought that the appointment of Ken to the Senate was the right thing to do. By any standard, Ken was better known, better prepared, had served as governor for 2 terms, had served as Secretary of State before that, had himself been a courageous and effective governor. And Muskie was fully justified in urging that Joe appoint him. But I think that Muskie had known me only in the capacity of a member of his staff. Joe had known me first as a member of his staff, but then as an equal, running in a primary campaign, and then both of us on the ballot together in the general election. And I believe that Joe saw in me the potential that Muskie may not have seen at that time as a candidate in my own right and as an office holder in my own right. I believe that Muskie was fully justified in making the recommendation that he felt was best for Maine. That was the standard he applied. And Joe was equally justified in going another route and making a decision not to appoint the man who Muskie recommended, but to appoint me, because Joe felt, from his perspective, that was the right thing to do. And that's another reason that I've always admired and respected and been grateful to Joe. Because the reality is, of course, that we wouldn't be doing this interview. I would never have been in the Senate. This is one of hundreds of interviews that I would not have done had Joe not appointed me to the Senate.
Professor Maurice Fitzpatrick is an Irish professor, author, and filmmaker. He's well known both in Ireland and America for The Boys of St. Columb's, which is a review of several young men who attended this school in Derry, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and two of whom went on to earn Nobel Prizes, Seamus Heaney in literature and John Hume the Nobel Peace Prize. His second work was Translations Revisited, based on the Brian Friel play by that name. He is currently working on a film subtitled John Hume in America. He is now completing filming on that, and it should be completed soon. Maurice Fitzpatrick was raised in the town of Belturbet, County Cavan. It's a border county. It's actually located in Ulster, but not in Northern Ireland. It is in the Republic of Ireland, very close to the border. As such, Maurice and his neighbors were strongly affected by the destruction of the Aherlane Bridge in the early 1970s. It was never conclusively decided who was responsible for this, but Professor Fitzpatrick has his suspicions. In 1999, the bridge was reopened with great fanfare. It was renamed the George Mitchell Peace Bridge because the year earlier, the Good Friday Agreement had been signed, and George Mitchell, as you all know, played a major role in that.
Mr. Brennan's decision was quite right. He would have understood, I think, the importance of family and of community and of connections. Ireland is a small place, it's an island, and picking Senator Mitchell for that role was proved a very solid choice, and I think I'm sure he made it on the basis of intellectual judgment, but also a certain degree of solid instincts as well.
I think it was very important for Ireland. I think he was very successful with the Good Friday Accords. And I was over in Ireland sometime near that, and somebody invited us to the Derby, as they call it, the equivalent of the Kentucky Derby. And I was with Senator Mitchell walking over to the box they had arranged for him. And everybody seemed to know him. Everybody was excited. Probably saying, who's that guy traveling with him? No, I think it was important. But he's got a stick-to-itiveness. He stayed the course. It wasn't easy. It was a delegate. There's a lot of spirit over there. And I think he did a great job. I don't know how many trips he made across the ocean, 30, 40, or 50, working that. And he stayed the course and did an excellent job. In fact, I guess he was knighted by the Queen, which is kind of weird, for we Irish, Sir George. We didn't have the greatest relationship with the English, the way they treated some of my countrymen from the old country years ago.
My earliest recollections of Senator Mitchell were the headlines, the big splashes was quite amazing. President Clinton was sending a special envoy to attempt to broker peace in the North. it was quite a breakthrough. I know it was President Clinton honoring his election promise. And yeah, I remember that as being very significant because already both communities, so-called, both sides in the North, were edging towards peace, and it seemed that they would have benefited from presence from the United States side to oversee these talks, to push these talks forward, to see a way through the very many smaller issues, which were, of course, subsections of the bigger issue of power sharing and mutual recognition, politically speaking, in the North. So, in a word, yes, it was very exciting that he was coming, and it remained to be seen, of course, how much of an impact he could make. It was high drama, it was suspense, whether this man, in addition to all the other people trying to push for peace, whether he could have a decisive role. Senator Mitchell has a very special role in my local area because of the George Mitchell Peace Bridge. That was and is a very symbolic bridge in that it was destroyed at the very outset of the Troubles in 1972, and it was reconstructed in 1999. It sort of bookends the Troubles, the outbreak of the Troubles and the end of the Troubles. And why was it blown up? Remains a mystery. Unlike some explosions and indeed assassinations throughout the Troubles in the North, nobody claimed responsibility for this act of destruction. But it seems very clear that loyalist paramilitaries were involved, and indeed that the British Secret Service may have prompted them and aided and abetted them in destroying this. It was destroyed, I believe, and many in my locality believe, because the North and South, the nexus between them, this bridge was a nexus between both jurisdictions, was too porous. It was too easy to get from south to north, from north to south. And with the destruction of that bridge, it became extremely difficult. One had to route around Ballyconnell, Derry Lynn. It became very awkward to go to the north. And as a result, people didn't go as much to the north. People didn't travel as often from north to south either. So it achieved its objectives, and it economically hindered progress in the area for that generation. It hindered people's lives. It cut people off. A very, very sad thing. And when it was reopened, and all the great and the good were there, but President Mary Robinson was President of Ireland at the time, and the grand theme of her incumbency was building bridges, which of course is, with the George Mitchell Peace Bridge, is literally the case and metaphorically the case. North and South were now more connected. It happened, of course, against the backdrop of the Earn-Shannon waterway connection, which is, again, very symbolic. The longest river in Ireland connected with the River Earn, which runs north and south as well. And it was an exciting time, I have to say. Senator Mitchell present, brokering peace, and the Good Friday Agreement, of course, John Hume, absolutely instrumental in bringing both sides together. 1990s economic prosperity as well. I was a child very much of that time, and several things seemed to come together.
In 1999, just 1 year after the Good Friday Agreement was signed, George Mitchell wrote Making Peace, which talked about the difficulties and the stresses and sacrifices required for assisting in the peace process in Northern Ireland. It required, on his part, patience, tolerance, and open-mindedness, 3 traits which he displayed in great abundance. In the summer of 2015, I was fortunate enough to interview Senator George Mitchell at his summer home in Seal Harbor, Maine, in proximity to Acadia National Park. In this interview, George Mitchell recalled the dangers and stressors which were present, especially in the final days just before the Good Friday Agreement was signed in April of 1998. While interviewing Senator Mitchell in his home in Seal Harbor, Maine, in the summer of 2015, I noticed a poem on his wall from the famous Irish poet Seamus Heaney. It was dedicated to George Mitchell because of his work for peace. It was entitled The Gift of Peace in Northern Ireland, an excerpt of which goes as follows. One of the paradoxical blessings of the past 2.5 decades of Northern Ireland's history has been an emergent vision of peace as a creative condition in which cultural, political, and doctrinal differences can be actively confessed and intelligently contested. This poem I see as a tremendous tribute to the work of Senator Mitchell for peace in Ireland and Northern Ireland.
And at the end, I described this briefly in my book, when everybody knew it was coming to an end and the tension was thick as fog, and there were quite a few death threats. And so they came to me and said, you gotta spend, they said, you're vulnerable when you're not at the talks.
Right.
Going back and forth, leaving the hotels. So that's when I started changing and moving. And they said, you gotta cut down on the number of nights you spend here. So I used to fly from New York to London. There were no direct flights to Belfast then. And I'd catch a late flight from London to Belfast, and I'd get in Sunday night about 11 o'clock. And so I'd get a night's sleep, then I'd go to the talks. They insisted that I fly overnight and come to Belfast the next morning and go directly to the talks. It was murder. I was so exhausted I couldn't keep my eyes open. But that eliminated one night.
Yes.
They eliminated a night. On the other end, I always stayed on Wednesday nights. We met 3 days and left Thursday morning. They insisted that when we finished our talks on Wednesday night, the British government provided a jet for me to fly me to London.
Yeah.
And I would stay at a hotel at Heathrow Airport, and I would leave for New York early the next morning. So the nights I was in Belfast went from 4 to 2 on a typical week. Sometimes I stayed for 2 weeks at a time, but went from 4 to 2 for security reasons. And it was very, very tense right up to the last tail end of it.
You mentioned the title of Senator Mitchell's latest book, The Negotiator. He believes in getting from A to B, from conquering difficulties through negotiation. That is John Hume's middle name.
Davy Redmond, myself, Joe, and Bob Dumpy, the four of us, flew up to Londonderry. We were having supper with John Hume, with a bishop of the diocese, with the editor of the local paper of the Londonderry, some doctor, I don't recall who he was, but I believe there was 5 of them, 4 of us. Probably the most important day of my life was sitting down at the table with John Hume and all of his hierarchy.
He tried and tried from his earliest life, earliest initiatives in Derry, to be inclusive. His famous mantra was, we'll spill our sweat, not our blood, to get people working together, and to also to build bridges, metaphorically too, in Derry. He was also, I should say, from the northwest, albeit a good deal further north, where I grew up, and he wrote his MA thesis on the way in which the northwest had been strangulated economically, and the need for economic inward investment. So he had that vision, and he did succeed in bringing a great deal of American companies to the north. Derry Boston Ventures, as it became known. So I think a lot unites the two gentlemen in question, and also the very affable personalities. I think that really is important when you are dealing with deep division. You have to understand too that the human dimension is very important. And all in all, between the two, they accomplished a great deal for the people in Ireland, and we're very grateful.
And Mitchell comes from a humble background. His mother's from Lebanon. She worked in a factory. His father worked as the landscaper at Colby College. He worked hard to get where he got. And he's a tremendous worker. He's had an excellent public record.
I honestly believe you made a great choice with George Mitchell. Not Ed Muskie, Joe Brennan.
I mean, his talent was recognized by the U.S. Senators. He was elected majority leader after 8 years. I think George could have been a serious candidate for president. He would have been smarter than all the presidents I've known. I think he was probably encouraged to run from time to time. And he was interested, I think, at one time in being Secretary of State. And he's been kind of a de facto Secretary of State under Clinton, dealing with the issues over in Northern Ireland, and under Obama, where he was involved in the Palestinian Israeli issues. And of course, after 9/11, he was the first choice, along with Henry Kissinger, to look into how it all happened, what we could do about it. And obviously he's a big expert in baseball. He ran that thing too. No, he's been a Maine treasure.
Today, we find both of these men still working actively for causes that they find dear. Joe Brennan recently has retired from the Federal Maritime Commission. He was the first recipient of the Maine Irish Heritage Center CLADA Award, also given later to George Mitchell. And he is still living on his beloved Munjoy Hill with his wife Connie, and he is very proud of the accomplishments of his two children. For George Mitchell, his greatest joy today is the Mitchell Scholarship Program, which has strong connections still with Ireland and Northern Ireland. And each year, there is one recipient from each and every high school in the state of Maine, including small schools on the islands off the coast of Maine, such as Islesboro and Vinyl Haven. Today, he splits his time between his home in New York City with his wife Heather and two children, and his summer vacation home in Seal Harbor, Maine, near Acadia National Park. Symbolically, Boston's mayor, Marty Walsh, also has paternal roots in the same townland in Ireland, Califinish, which is shared by Joe Brennan's mother, and also, parenthetically, by my grandfather, Coleman Connolly. The concluding question: could peace in Northern Ireland have been achieved without the work of these two men from Maine, or in fact from their immigrant roots in Ireland and Lebanon, and those people who chose to come and start a new life in Maine? It's unsure. We can never know the answer to this question. All that we can know is that many bridges connected people over time and place, and critical decisions were made by many people, including Joe Brennan and George Mitchell, which helped bring together the likelihood of peace in Northern Ireland. All people in Maine, Ireland, and elsewhere share a debt of gratitude to both George Mitchell and Joe Brennan. We'll conclude in Brennan's own words.
He was pro-working person, pro-labor, pro-Franklin Roosevelt, pro-Harry Truman. I mean, he had it right without any fancy schoolhousing. He understood without using the fancy words of social justice and economic justice. He understood fairness. He understood opportunity. He understood that, just average people ought to be given a chance, a shot in life.
That seems to be your philosophy.
I think it's the Democratic philosophy, or at least it was when I was active.
Can you hear me as you roam through lonely London town? When evening's falling, you'll hear me calling. Come on home now to the county down. Do you remember the fiddlers playing the songs and stories the whole night long? 'Tis little then that you thought of leaving. It seems so strange now that you are gone. Oh, can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me as you roam through lonely London town? When evening's falling, you'll hear me calling. Come on home.